You're looking at a dead man. That's right. You've never seen a dead man speak, have you? Oh, you may have seen someone die, perhaps seen a dead body at a funeral, but you've never seen someone who was dead for 4 days, alive, talking and walking around. Yes, I'm Lazarus, the man Jesus raised from the dead. My sisters Mary and Martha and I occupy a rather prominent place in the gospel story, perhaps even more prominent than you know. I'm not sure just exactly how my family and Jesus became so close. We had known Joseph and Mary, and our families had been together through the years. I guess we just became close through all that contact. So maybe it was natural that when Jesus began his public ministry, our home became his home. You know, Jesus never had a home of his own once he left Nazareth. In fact, I remember one time when someone wanted to follow him, he said, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." He had no home of his own, but he knew he was always welcome in our home. And he and his disciples spent many nights as our guests. It was a place for Jesus to get away. As more and more people came to know him, it seemed he never had time for himself. Someone was always wanting something, people pressing in on him from every side. When he came to our house, he could relax, at least for a little while. I wish I could tell you what it was like to be the friend of Jesus. He was an unbelievable person. Oh, I know, he was the Messiah, the Son of God. I guess we knew that, and we believed it. After all, his mother Mary had told us the circumstances of his birth, and we had witnessed him perform many miracles, but I guess we didn't think of him that way. He was just Jesus, a friend, a best friend anyone could have. Whenever he would visit, he would always pitch in and help around the house. He had been a carpenter, you know, and so if anything needed fixing, well, he just did it. We were always fascinated by his interpretations of Scripture. It was as though he could take the most complicated things and make them simple. Things I could never understand before suddenly became crystal clear. When he came to our house, even with the crowd sometimes waiting outside, he brought a peace that I can't explain. Well, I suppose you're eager to hear just what happened to me. To tell you the truth, most of what I can tell you comes from Martha and Mary, my sisters. They were the ones who later told me all that had happened. The only thing I remember about anything is being sick. It started with a fever. I was very weak. I told my sister Mary I was going to lie down, told her about the fever. She got a cold towel and put it on my head. It felt so good. I know I lay there for several days, and the fever just wouldn't seem to go away. They tell me I was often delirious. I can remember the look on their faces and sensing by their concerned looks that my condition was serious. I heard them talking about calling for Jesus. I know what they were thinking. We'd all seen Jesus cure so many diseases and illnesses. Surely he would be able to help me. As I said, that's all I remember. For it was shortly after that time that I died. If you had asked me, even before I died, what would happen, I could have told you, because funerals in that part of the country were all pretty much alike. Some years ago, people would go to all sorts of extremes at funerals. The dead person was anointed with the most costly spices, and then often buried with prized possessions and all sorts of other material goods. Why, one family would try to outdo the other in extravagant funerals. Then Gamaliel, the great rabbi, came along and saying he only wanted the simplest ceremony for his death. And little by little, people began to change, and funerals became more simple. Bodies were dressed in a long linen cloth. The Hebrew word for it translated traveling dress. Quite appropriate, don't you think? Then hands and feet were wrapped in burial bandages. I also knew that I would be buried in the family burial cave, not too far from where we lived. The hot climate meant that burial often took place on the day of the death, because bodies would begin to decay quickly in the hot sun. So I knew that one day I would be buried this way. Mary and Martha, my sisters, told me exactly what happened, and I was buried just as I described. What I could not know is what would happen next. Mary and Martha had sent word to Jesus that I was sick, thinking that he would come running. But he didn't. In fact, it was several days before he came. By that time, I had been dead for 4 days. Martha said she heard Jesus was coming and went out to the road to meet him. She feels bad about it now, but at the time she was angry that Jesus had taken so long. She blurted out, "Lord, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died." After they talked, she went to get Mary, and Mary, she said the same thing to Jesus. They both said that Jesus spent quite a bit of time with them there on the road, and Jesus never did come to the house, at least not right away. They told me that Jesus was quite broken up, and he wept openly. He then asked to be taken to the tomb. When they got there, I guess he asked for the stone to be rolled away from the entrance to the cave, but they told him not to, because the stench of death would be too great. Everyone thought he just wanted to have one last look at his friend, I guess. Then, I'm told, he looked to God to pray. And after he prayed, he cried out. Now, here is where my memory is perfectly fine. I can't tell you what happened while I was sick or during those 4 days after my death, but I can certainly tell you firsthand what was said. It was this, as if I was in a deep sleep, and I heard these words. They sounded far away, yet loud. "Lazarus, come out." I opened my eyes. I didn't know where I was. I was so weak. It was dark, but a blazing light was coming from somewhere. I sat up. I turned my head, and I saw that the light was coming from the entrance or door. I looked around. saw skeletons lying around me, and I realized where I was. A burial tomb. What was I doing in a burial tomb? Then I started to stand up, and I saw that I was wearing these burial clothes and burial bandages, and then it began to dawn on me. I had been sick, and I had been buried, but I couldn't understand. Had I been buried alive? Or if I were dead, what was happening now? I couldn't understand anything. I walked to the door of the tomb, and outside, crowds of people were standing and staring at me. Then I saw him. Jesus was standing with his arms outstretched and smiling. People were gasping. I saw one faint to the ground. But soon others were yelling and screaming, clapping their hands, praying and dancing. Some came up to me, patted me on the back. Others stayed back and just staring as if they were too afraid to get too close. The next thing I knew, they were taking me back to the house, and everyone was talking at once, telling me what had happened. And I had been dead no less than 4 days, decaying in the tomb when Jesus, after praying, calling out to me, had raised me from the dead. It all seemed so unbelievable. But then, there I was. So who was I to argue? It took me several days to get used to the idea. Mary and Martha told me over and over again what happened, and I kept asking them to tell me one more time. I couldn't get enough of the story. It was so remarkable. It was the most unbelievable miracle I had ever heard of. I wish I could tell you that life was easy after that. It wasn't. The religious leaders were so upset over what had happened and the fact that countless Jews were leaving their synagogues to follow Jesus that they immediately began to plot to kill him. It was no secret to any of us. But that wasn't all. If you read in your gospel story beyond the account of Jesus raising me from the dead, you'll also read that because so many were coming to see me, the evidence of the miracle, the religious leaders also plotted to kill me as well. They thought if they could get rid of the evidence and then get rid of the miracle worker, everything would get back to normal. Nothing was ever normal again. It was only a short time later that Jesus was arrested. I was there at the foot of the cross when he died. I heard his last words. Nothing you could have done could have taken me away from Jesus. Not after what he did. No threats on my life. Nothing would keep me from being there for him and doing all I could. None of us could understand why he had to die. What had he done? Loved people? Healed people? Listened to people? Helped people? Is that a cause for death? No. It was pure fear on the part of the religious leaders, fear that people would follow Jesus rather than them. When Jesus died, all of our worlds seemed to collapse. How often in those days I wished he had just left me to rot in that tomb rather than raise me and watch him die. But then a couple of days later, we began hearing reports of those who had seen Jesus alive. Many would not believe, but then they had not been there when Jesus raised me to life. Anyone who had been at my tomb would know. If Jesus could raise me after 4 days in the tomb, God would and could raise Jesus from the dead. It was a few days later when we saw him. I've never been so glad to see someone. I wish I could tell you that everything was easy then. It wasn't. It seemed someone was always plotting my death because I was still the most visible evidence of a man who had power over death. But no matter how difficult life would get, I could go on. I, perhaps more than anyone else, had felt the power of Jesus turning death into life.